Christmas is the perfect time for a ghost story, and tonight I have quite a famous one to share with you. It's a classic Christmas ghost story, but there's more to this one than you might expect. Because one of the houses where this story is said to have happened, Bramshill House, is allegedly home to up to 14 other ghosts. And so that's where we begin tonight with the legend of the Mistletoe Bough. It was a wintry cold Christmas day in the early 18th century, and Bramshill House was decorated with holly for the festivities. But it wasn't just Christmas that the family was celebrating that day, as it was also their daughter's wedding day. The guests had gathered for the celebration, and the air was filled with warmth and joy. The young bride, dressed in a beautiful white wedding gown, carried a sprig of mistletoe as her bouquet, as she prepared to marry her betrothed. The vows were exchanged, the happy couple were married, and the revelry commenced, celebrating this new husband and wife who were ready to start enjoying their future together. But little did anyone know that that future would never come. After the wedding breakfast, the bride, so radiant and full of life, grew weary of dancing and instead requested to her new husband and their guests that she would love to play hide and seek. Bramshill House is a big place, lots of hiding spots. It seemed to be the perfect evening entertainment for this special day. With a smile, she slipped away into the shadows of the mansion, leaving her guests to count up the 5 minutes before they started searching for her. Once the 5 minutes had passed, everyone was still feeling jovial, checking behind curtains, underneath beds, in wardrobes, wherever this bride could have positioned herself. But the minutes turned into hours, and still this young bride was nowhere to be found. The atmosphere turned more desperate, and as time marched on, optimism was waning. The guests and the grooms searched high and low, calling her name, trying to entice her out with the promise that you are the undisputed champion of the game, you have won fair and square. But still, nothing. Not a single trace of her. Where could she be? Why hadn't she emerged? Was she injured or unwell or even lost? Her new husband was frantic with worry, growing more and more distressed with each passing moment. He checked everywhere he could think of. He retraced his steps. He did everything. Even as wedding guests started departing for the night. Still, no sign of his wife. Days passed and rumours began to spread. Whispers that maybe she had fled the marriage, unable to bear the weight of her new life. And that instead, she had run away from the house to escape. Regardless, her husband continued to search the house. Decades passed. The once hopeful groom had aged, his face etched with lines of worry and sorrow, of longing for what could have been. The mansion had become weathered and worn, becoming a labyrinth of disused rooms and forgotten memories. One day, as the old man was searching in the attic of the house, his hand knocked gently against the oak panelling. To his surprise, it made a hollow sound underneath his touch. That was strange, he thought to himself. He'd never noticed that before. He continued to inspect this suspiciously hollow panel until a secret door swung open in the panelling, revealing a hidden room within the walls. The room was empty, save for one piece of dusty furniture in the centre, an old, ornately carved wooden chest. The man crept towards this chest, his eyes transfixed on it, the one hiding place in the house he had never checked before. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid, and there, lying within, were the skeletal remains of his bride, still dressed in her wedding gown, the sprig of mistletoe clutched tightly in her bony hand. The inside of the lid bore deep, criss-crossing scratches, evidence of her frantic attempts to escape the claustrophobic confines of her prison, but to no avail, as the chest couldn't be opened from the inside, and instead became her tomb, an unmarked grave, forgotten by time. The spirit of the lost bride is said to still roam Bramshill House, forever trapped in the place where she vanished. Her story was told and retold over and over again in the 19th and 20th centuries, including this poem, The Mistletoe Bough, by Thomas Haynes Bailey, which ends as follows. "Oh, sad was her fate, in sportive jest, she hid from her lord in an old oak chest. It closed with a spring, and her bridal bloom lay withering there in that living tomb." And so that is the legend of the Mistletoe Bough that has been popularised in poems, songs, etchings, even a silent movie in 1904. And as it turned from a story into basically a legend, a lot of locations attempted to lay claim to the origins. Everyone was clambouring to say that it was their stately home or castle where this unfortunate wedding tragedy took place, including Marwell Hall, Exton Hall, Brockdish Hall, and Castle Hornock, just to name a few. But out of all of them, there is one house that I really wanted to draw your attention to today, and that is Bramshill House. Not only because of this story, but Bramshill has a bunch of other weird stuff going on here too. But with the story of the Mistletoe Bough, we're talking about a ghost story, so of course, in true Don't Scare Claire fashion, there are a couple of gaps that I need to tell you about before we go any further. First of all, a lot of people obviously want to know who this mysterious bride was, whose life and death was it based on. She was believed to be a woman called Anne Cope, the daughter of Sir John Cope of Bramshill House. And her new husband was a guy called Hugh Bethel, who she would have married sometime in the early 1700s. That's about the time frame we're talking here. However, fast forward to 1890, the then owner of Bramshill House and a relative of this Anne Cope, Sir William Cope, he decided that he needed to do his bit to clear some things up. Presumably, he's sick of his mates popping around and asking about this poor woman who died in the chest on her wedding day. Maybe the more macabre amongst them keep asking him to see the infamous chest. And so he actually wrote a pamphlet where he laid out everything he knew about this story and how it related to Bramshill House. And so first of all, the chest. It wasn't there anymore. He said that the chest concerned in the story that would have been around the house at the right time would have been removed from the property in 1812 by the widow of Sir Denzil Cope, the 10th Baronet, on his death. Obviously his wife, Elizabeth Dorothea Francis, she would have been bequeathed everything when he died, and so she would have taken all of her husband's stuff with her. And the chest that's at Bramshill House now, that's just an exact copy, apparently. It's not the genuine thing. But then the real cat amongst the pigeons was that Sir William Cope claimed that, as far as he could tell, there were no records of any Cope woman dying on or shortly after her wedding day, especially not by getting stuck in a chest. So, yeah. Because although we've got records of Anne Cope dying relatively young, she would have been about 28 years old when she passed away. Anne and Hugh actually went on to have 2 children, so the timelines ain't timelining, you know? But there is more. There was another story saying that the unfortunate bride wasn't Anne Cope, but instead was an Italian woman called Ginevra Orsini, and I apologise, my Italian pronunciation is even worse than my French. But the story goes that she played hide and seek at her wedding in Italy and got locked in the chest and passed away. And then at some point after that, the chest was sold, obviously long after they'd found Ginevra and laid her to rest, and the chest found its way to Bramshill House in England. But then, in a bit of a connection of the whole story, all of the dots being joined up, Sir John Cope, so Anne Cope's dad, he apparently spent many years of his life in Italy, and so that's maybe how this chest came to Bramshill. And then going further, that's how we have the connection to Anne Cope, because the timing seems sensible. It's a reach, and there's a lot of moving parts that would have to all line up, but you know, interesting nonetheless. But aside from the ghostly Christmas legend of the Mistletoe Bough, we have to talk about Bramshill House, starting all the way at the beginning, because we've got records of Bramshill dating all the way back to the Domesday Book in 1086, where the estate was known as Bromsell and was owned by Hugh de Port, who was a Norman aristocrat, very high up, noble, powerful. By the 14th century though, the Foxley family had taken on the estate, and Sir Thomas Foxley, he'd got permission to enclose 2,500 acres of land to be used as a deer park. Obviously, once he'd sorted that, he needed a house that would reflect the status of a man who has enough money and sway to just create a huge deer park, right? And so between 1351 and 1360, Bramshill House was built to reflect the wealth and status of the Foxley family. Time did the inevitable though and kept on ticking on, and the estate passed through several different families until we get to 1605. Edward, the 11th Lord Zouche of Haringworth, which is a bit of a mouthful, so I'm just going to call him Lord Zouche from now on. He was the ambassador to Scotland and the Lord President of the Council of Wales, as well as the Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports. So again, he's another man who's very powerful, very high up. He bought Bramshill House and started a major reconstruction project. And I say major project, he basically pretty much tore down the entire house that was already standing, save for things like parts of the cellars and bits like that, and he built pretty much the house that we can see today over the course of about 7 years, finishing in 1612. He'd set out to build one of the grandest houses around, and you could say that he succeeded in that. He'd done alright. In 1620, King James I, he paid a visit to the house, so, you know, it was good enough for royalty. And in 1621, the Archbishop of Canterbury, another incredibly important person, he visited the estate too. But it was this visit in July 1621 which would end in tragedy. Because the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Abbot, he was visiting Bramshill House to be entertained by Lord Zouche. And so what's the best way for noblemen to do just that? Go out hunting in the deer park, of course. George had spotted a stag that he was going to go after and had aimed his crossbow, fired, and missed. He'd missed the stag, but not one of Lord Zouche's park keepers, a man called Peter Hawkins. Peter had been standing near to where the deer had been, for some reason, and the bolt from George Abbot's crossbow had hit him in the arm. It must have hit a major artery or something, as Peter Hawkins apparently died within the hour. The Archbishop was said to have been absolutely absolutely devastated by what he'd done. He felt so guilty. His enemies tried to capitalise on the whole thing and tried to use it as an excuse to get him kicked out of his position, but that didn't quite work out for them. However, George was apparently never the same after that incident. He was racked with guilt, wouldn't smile, incredibly melancholic. Witnesses say that Lord Zouche had apparently warned Peter about the Archbishop's erratic aiming. Maybe you might want to move out the way, mate. But then other people had started to say that Peter had been drinking and had stumbled into the line of fire. And then there were some people who claimed that Peter had jumped into the way of the bolt. But whatever the circumstances, Peter had unfortunately died on the estate in a horrendous hunting accident. A few years after that, in 1625, Lord Zouche himself would also pass away, not in a hunting accident or anything though, he just fell ill and died. And Bramshill House once again passed hands a few more times until 1699, when it was sold to Sir John Cope, the very same man you were introduced to in the beginning. Connecting all of the dots here. He paid £21,500 for it, and I know we all love a good inflation calculation, and so that would equate to almost £3.4 million today. But the Copes would actually stay at Bramshill House for centuries. The estate stayed in the family for almost 250 years, so that's pretty good going on your investment. Their stint at Bramshill House came to an end in 1935 though, when Lord Brocket bought the estate. But it would serve a very important purpose during World War II, when the house was used as a maternity home for evacuee mothers who were escaping the bombings down south in Portsmouth. After the war though, it had a different, albeit still super important purpose too, as it became home to royalty, still good enough for kings and queens even all these years later. The exiled King of Romania, King Michael I, his wife Queen Anne and their 2 kids, they all rented a wing of Bramshill House during the 1950s before they settled down in Switzerland, which then, it appears, marked the end of Bramshill House being used as a straight-up residence. In 1960, the Police Staff College relocated to Bramshill, where, as the name suggests, they trained police. And they were here for a few decades until they finally wound down and moved out in March 2015, when the building got too expensive to maintain. Nowadays, from what I can see, the building isn't used for anything. I think the police are still around it, it's still guarded and things like that, but that's it. The house did get a Hollywood cameo when it was the location for Cruncham Hall Elementary School in the 2022 film Matilda the Musical. And in 2021, I saw that the house was up for sale for a cool 10 million. Other sources say that it was 25 million, but it's not on Rightmove anymore. I don't know if it's sold, if it's still for sale, but if anyone has a spare 10 million that they want to give me, I can think of a great use for it. In September 2024, there was demolition work being done to some of the 20th century buildings on the grounds. I think what had been used for the police college rather than the actual house itself. But other than that, if you know what's going on with the place now, please do let me know in the comments. I am desperate to find out more. I hope that at some point it can be open to the public. I think it is a gorgeous place. It's grade 1 listed, so just for the history alone would be worth it. But also, I don't know, it's only known as one of the most haunted houses in Hampshire with a bunch of ghosts, so there's also that. Honestly, it was claimed that there were 14 ghosts haunting Bramshill House, which is utterly wild. I think I'm going to have to put a ghost counter on the screen or something and we can test this together. So get ready to keep a note about the ghosts. I want to see what number you come up with at the end too. And so the first entity I'm going to talk about is obviously a lady connected to the legend of the Mistletoe Bough, because there has been a ghostly lady in a white dress witnessed walking around the property, leading people to believe that she is the poor unfortunate bride. She was even allegedly witnessed by King Michael I when him and his family were staying there in the 50s. He actually asked for his kids to be moved to another room to avoid a certain woman in white and her disturbances. Apparently this ghostly woman was causing all sorts of trouble, and poor Queen Anne saw this figure as well, running down the hall. But she looked so lifelike. Queen Anne even asked the manager of the house who was the young woman staying here, as Anne had seen her sitting in the king's chair while she was watching telly, as if it was the most casual, normal thing in the world to do. Apparently this lady in white has also been seen around the infamous chest replica, so that's a very interesting, if a little convenient detail maybe, isn't it? But this ghost in particular, and this collection of stories, it does get a little messy. Some people say that there are 2 women in white seen at Bramshill House. One is the bride, and the other is a seemingly unknown lady. But there are others who say that this next story must be the same lady in white as the one that the Romanian royal family saw, as in, there's only one woman in white, the bride. Apparently, one night multiple people saw this woman in a white dress walking along the balustrade. Immediately, logical thinking prevails. It must be a housemaid out sleepwalking, or maybe she's unwell, something like that. Either way, she's acting acting rather inappropriately, so they called for the butler to go and check on the girl and sort her out. As the butler walked towards this figure though, she disappeared, with some accounts saying that she leapt from the balustrade. But just as an example of how messy this whole thing is though, that story is often connected to William Cope, and it was him and his family who saw her. But in William's pamphlet, he says that no spectral white lady has ever been seen there by any living witnesses. So it looks like a lot of these stories have had details changed and mixed up as the years have gone on, but we do what we can. I am inclined to believe though, even with the stories and such, that there's probably only one woman in white, so the ghost counter is still at 1 for now. But this mess, it gets even worse, when some accounts claim that the story about the figure on the balustrade wasn't this mysterious woman in white, or the ghostly bride, but another spectral woman, the Grey Lady. And she definitely counts as ghost number 2 on the counter. There are a lot of stories about her. She is usually seen around 3 AM because, of course she is, but she's been spotted in a few places around the house, the library, the terrace, the fleur-de-lis room, and the chapel. Her appearance is really interesting though, as she appears with golden coloured hair that's all dishevelled, it's barely holding its ringlets, and she's wearing a plain, straight, sleeveless robe, almost like a shroud. She has tear-stained cheeks, and people describe her eyes as being black, having a kind of dead light in them. So it sounds like she's utterly distraught. She's been through it, you know? Regardless, I still really would not like to encounter her at 3 in the morning. And one way to know whether she's around or not is the unmistakable smell of lilies. No flowers around at all, and you just feel like you got sucker punched by the floral smell out of nowhere. While Sir Denzil Cope was living in Bramshill in the later 1800s into the 1900s, his wife Edna, she apparently saw this Grey Lady. She was in bed one night and she just so happened to wake up and see this woman peering over her. Nope, time to move out, absolutely not. Their kids even saw her too. Joan Penelope Cope, she was born in 1926, and when she was about 12 years old, she actually wrote a book about living at Bramshill. They were basically her memoirs that she got published, and included in it was her experience of the ghosts. She claimed that both her and her brother Anthony had witnessed the Grey Lady on multiple occasions, always looking in a dreadful state, tears almost rolling down her cheeks, just so sad. And she continued to be seen long after the Copes had moved out. Fred Cook was the guy who was put in charge of looking after the mansion after it stopped being a private family residence, and so he would do nightly patrols, check everything's shipshape and shiny, all of that, and he was apparently there for 40 years, very dedicated to his job and a complete skeptic of the paranormal at first. Anytime anyone would come up to him, if they had been staying overnight in the house for whatever reason and they'd experienced something weird or seen a ghost, he would always just be like, oh, it's just a trick of the light, you're definitely mistaken. That would all change one evening while he was doing his nightly rounds. He was walking around the house with his dog, a Labrador, and he just so happened to open the doors into the long gallery to walk through. As soon as he looks into the long gallery, there is the Grey Lady. Grey dress, messy hair, sad face, the lot. Fred freezes and thinks, this can't be real, this is still a trick of the light? But the thing is, his dog also reacted to the Grey Lady. This poor dog about flipped out and then went bolting back the way that she'd come, straight for home, and Fred was not too far behind her. Once they both got back into the safety of their own house, Fred kind of calms down, and at the end of the day, it's still his job to patrol the house, so he knows he needs to go back and check it all over. The dog was having absolutely none of it, and so Fred left her in front of the fireplace at home. When he headed back to what he was now suspecting was a haunted mansion, he walked through, eyes on the prize, headed straight for the long gallery, but when he gets there, there's nothing except for that unmistakable smell of lilies. Some people say that this woman in grey is distraught about her husband, who was executed for being a religious dissenter, and that he now actually haunts the stables. But other than that actual story, I couldn't find any witness accounts or proof of who he was or that he was actually executed or anything like that, so sorry my guy, you're not being added to the counter. Am I being a bit too stingy with the ghost counter? Maybe. But one entity who I am definitely adding to the list is that of the Green Man. Ghost number 3, is that what we're up to? This name is actually very descriptive, as he appears as a green man wearing all green clothes, and he's said to appear by the Pale Pond a lot, but really any body of water, even a large puddle once. Joan Penelope Cope, the woman who wrote the book about Bramshill House when she was 12, she claimed that the Green Man was one of those entities that her and her brother would see. She was only in a pushchair when she first saw this Green Man, and when asked to describe what she had seen, she said he looked like Daddy but with no legs, which is an interesting detail, because this Green Man is said to have been an eccentric member of the Cope family called Sir Henry Cope, and he was obsessed with the colour green. Green everything. Green clothes, green furniture, green wallpaper. Even his horses wore green livery to pull his green gig, which, in case you don't know, is a two-wheeled carriage. He would also apparently only eat green food, so only green fruits and vegetables. He was committed to it. The only stumbling block to this whole green lifestyle of his was allegedly his boots. Because see, he always wore these fashionable Hessian boots, but the thing was, they didn't come in green. So he had no choice but to wear black ones. Interesting then that little Joan Penelope Cope couldn't see or didn't notice his legs. But this guy, Sir Henry Cope, he became a bit of a legend in the Brighton area, infamous for his absolute greenness. And he was said to be kind of a big deal, being friends with George IV before he became king. But this particular story does take a darker turn because the Green Man isn't just remembered for his favourite colour, he's got a bit of a tragic ending too. It's said that Sir Henry Cope eventually decided to take his own life in 1806 by jumping off the cliffs at Brighton. When people found him though, he was bleeding from the ears and mouth, but he was still alive and actually went on to make a full recovery from this attempt, which was reported in the local newspaper at the time. After that, we don't have any record of what happened to him, although a lot of people believe that he made a second attempt not too long after, and this time he was successful. And while I was reading this story, there was something that just made me think, how did Sir William Cope get so much green? How did a lot of people back in the early 1800s have access to green things? He would have likely been exposed to a lot of arsenic, right? As it was everywhere. And arsenic does sometimes cause changes in your mental health, increased anxiety and depression, along with a whole host of other painful symptoms that might not have made living life super great. Do you see where I'm going with all of this? The Morning Observer claimed that the Green Man was actually a student of Lincoln's Inn, and so he was studying to be a barrister, and his intense study drove him mad. But others say that he had lost his wits after falling in love with a beautiful woman, who I'm guessing didn't feel the same way. Either way, that's the story of the Green Man, and regardless of how he died and where he died, he has been seen now haunting Bramshill House. But he's not the only entity roaming the estate's grounds. There's quite a few out here actually. Ghost number 4 of Bramshill House is none other than Peter Hawkins, the poor park keeper who lost his life in the hunting accident caused by the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1621. And it looks like Peter isn't ready to let go of the place just yet. He's apparently been seen standing near an old tree, funnily enough now called Keeper's Oak, and he appears at night with some faint glow around him. Some people have also claimed that he's been seen drinking from a flask, and that's why some people think that he was drinking on the job back in the 17th century, so there's that. Another ghost from the estate's hunting days isn't one specific entity, but multiple. I'm just counting them all as one phenomena. Either way, I'd be totally okay to see these guys, even if the story is somewhat creepy, because people walking through the grounds of the estate have heard the disembodied howls of hounds. And I mean, yeah, sure, it could be another dog walker in the area, howls carrying the wind, but these people claim to never come across any dogs, nothing like that. And then combined with the fact that sometimes some people actually see these ghostly dogs, appearing as a pack of white hunting hounds, watching you from behind a tree, you know, kind of makes you think. I mean, it sounds very ominous, and I'm sure it would be very creepy if you're on your own or whatever, but ghost puppies? I would take all of them home. But considering the deer park was created in the 1300s and people were hunting on these grounds for centuries after that, it wouldn't be unreasonable to assume that more than a few hunting hounds have lost their lives on the Bramshill House estate. But then there's the story of a gardener, and apparently this one is bad news. The story goes that he drowned in the lake on the estate, but he's not moved on to whatever comes next for us. He's still there where he died, and he's mean. According to Ian Fox in his book, The Haunted Places of Hampshire, this particular gardener is the only malevolent spirit at Bramshill House. People walking in that area have said that they've felt this crippling fear that came out of nowhere. No earthly reason for them to descend into effectively a panic attack. But this mortal fear, it doesn't go away until after you leave that area. Animals will pick up on this vibe too, dogs will run away without a second thought about you, horses will react to things that you can't see. It just seems like an entity that you really don't want to encounter. Some unfortunate witnesses have said that if you get too close, you'll feel something rush at you, like he's screaming in your face just to try and get you to leave the area. Okay, my guy, don't need to tell me twice. The thing is, there isn't, from what I could see, any evidence of a gardener drowning in the lake. I mean, the lake has been there a long time, so maybe it's just been lost to time, but worth pointing out anyway. But going back inside, there is a lot more to tell you about in here, especially in the chapel drawing room. So we're going to start speedrunning the ghost counter now. Are you ready? First of all, there's a woman, another ghostly woman, from around the time of the 1700s, and she's been seen walking across the room like she's a woman on a mission. She apparently holds her skirts up a bit as she's walking, so, you know, she won't trip or anything like that, but that's all the information we have on her. Also in this room, a nun has been seen wearing a black habit and clutching her rosary in her hand. And I mean, the chapel was one of the first buildings to be built on this site way back in the day, so, you know, there could be something there. There's also apparently been the ghost of a child seen in the chapel drawing room, and visitors have felt a cold child's hand take theirs when they're alone in there. Quite creepy. This child is also said to be responsible over the cries heard both in this room and down in the cellar, as well as books moving around off the bookshelves. But one really interesting phenomena is that sometimes people enter this room to see it full of people, as if a party is going on or something, but all of these people are dressed from a different time period entirely. They're all apparently floating a foot or two off the floor, which some people say is the height that the floor in that room used to be before renovations. But as soon as the crowd is spotted, they're gone again, and the person is left in the chapel drawing room alone, wondering what on earth just happened. Does that count as a ghost on the ghost counter? I'm gonna say that a ghost party counts as a ghost. If the hounds are included, then the party should be too. It's going in. Moving away from the chapel drawing room, there is a room next to that one which used to be a bedroom, and in there a woman dressed in a tight velvet green bodice with a rose-coloured skirt has been seen, looking to be around the time of King Charles I. There's also been an old man with a long white beard spotted looking out of the windows at the gardens, and apparently he's also been witnessed milling about the chest tied to the story of the Mistletoe Bough. A more recent entity is that of a youngish man dressed in 1920s tennis gear, racket and tennis ball in hand, which the house had tennis courts, so there's that, but he's been seen most often in the reception area of the house. There is a bit of debate as to who he is. Some sources say that he is Ronald Charles Manus Noel Kane, who was the son of the second Lord Brocket, who owned the house after the Copes. And I mean, Ronald did pass away young, aged 32, but he died in 1961, meaning he was born in the very late 1920s. And then other sources say that this guy was actually a member of the Cope family. Peter Underwood claimed that it was Joan Penelope's brother, Anthony. And then the story was that he had fallen from a train in the 1930s, but again, from my research, that doesn't seem quite right either. Anthony was born in 1927, and he passed away in 1966, aged 38, so again, I don't believe that he would have worn 1920s tennis gear as a young man, especially not at Bramshill, considering they moved out of that house in the 1930s. So it just seems like a bit of a mystery to me as to who he could actually be. But we're not done with the ghost just yet. There has also been a man in a grey flannel suit seen strolling along the path outside. Apparently, he was seen walking towards the house, where he entered and then walked through a wall. According to the witnesses, this happened in the 1970s, and this wall that the figure walked through used to be an archway. And then this next one wasn't necessarily seen, but was heard. Apparently, heavy boots would be heard walking on the stairs at night, along with the metallic sound of spurs clanging along with each step. And so with all of this phenomenon, a lot of it was witnessed by members of the Cope family through the years, especially the later years, as well as obviously King Michael and Queen Anne of Romania and their family. But then once Bramshill House became the police college, police officers and their superiors started seeing strange things too. A lot of accounts of smelling the lilies, the floral smell, and then other strange things like seeing figures, but just automatically assuming it's someone trespassing and coming up for a nosy in the house. And so when they then go to tell them to clear off, the figure just disappears in front of their eyes. There was also a really weird story where a police chief superintendent was sitting on the terrace with some students. It was just a normal day, it was about 1989, there was no wind, the air was completely still, when they started hearing a noise coming from the wrought iron gate nearby. They looked over to see the latch being lifted on this gate. The gate then opened by itself, waited a beat, and then closed, with the gate being put back on the latch. No wind, no one around. Something that they couldn't see just opened that gate and walked through. I mean, it's gonna make you sit up and take notice at college, I guess. And so whether Bramshill House is indeed the origin of the tragic Christmas ghost story or not, it seems pretty clear that in the centuries since the ill-fated wedding allegedly took place, the mansion has picked up more than a few other ghostly residents. But how many? First of all, this one was so awkward to pull together, which I do find to be the case with places that appear in so many books. Everyone's got a slightly different story to tell. But where I could, I used as primary resources as possible William Cope's pamphlet, Joan Penelope Cope's memoirs, that sort of thing. But even so, there are a lot of ghost stories here, right? I think the grand total on my ghost counter should have come up to about 15, but that is based on my own conclusions about the story. You might have more, you might have less, or you might even have none at all if you don't believe any of the stories. I do believe that Bramshill House is haunted by at least a few of the ghosts mentioned, but I also do believe that probably more than a few stories have been embellished over time. It's the natural order of things. And as for the bride in the Mistletoe Bough, I think that just like any of the places that lay claim to the story, yeah, it could have happened here, but I'd really like to see historical evidence, a record, which says that poor bride really did die on her wedding day. Until then, it's a wonderfully tragic, macabre story to share around Christmas time. But as always, let me know what you think, put your number of ghosts down in the comments, and please do like this video if you enjoyed it. And if you haven't already, but you like what I'm doing over here, maybe you'd like to subscribe too? That would be pretty cool if you did. But anyway, that is all from me today. I know we're starting to descend into the holiday season now, where it is so easy to say, I'll start again in January, but don't let your high hydration slip. Keep drinking that water along with your festive beverage of choice, please. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Oh my god, I cannot believe I didn't notice until halfway through this video that the drink I'm drinking right now is staining my tongue blue. Look at that, blue. So whatever this is that I just grabbed out of the fridge tastes great, black grape, but it will stain your tongue. And before anyone says it, I do also have water. I've just nearly finished and I always have 2 drinks on the go because one is never enough.